Bore da, good morning, and it's great to be with you, albeit in a recording this morning. I'm sorry I can't make it in person. I would have loved to have been there, but it's great, I think, to talk to you this morning about the role of health and well-being in the new curriculum and the role of research and evidence and data in supporting that. It's such a critical part of what we're doing as part of the new curriculum, and I'm really excited to be part of it in what is a really looks like a really interesting day. Um, Part of my role is just to set the scene, and just to give you a bit of background on myself. My name's Lloyd Hopkin. I'm currently the head of curriculum reform in Welsh Government, and prior to that I was head of the health and wellbeing area of learning and experience, and led the development of the area from what was back in the day a very blank piece of paper, and worked and had the honour and the privilege to work with some really great practitioners and supporting partners to develop the area of learning and experience that is now part of our new curriculum. And I just wanted to talk today a little bit, I think, about the opportunity that the Curriculum for Wales offers us to support and to secure our learners' well-being, and the huge opportunity that data and research offers in helping us do that. And I want to talk about a few different aspects of the curriculum in doing this. The first is the role that the new curriculum for Wales places and the emphasis it places in recognising health and well-being as a critical enabler of learning. This is quite clearly stated, and it's important, I think, to go back to the very basics as we go through the day in terms of recognising that healthy, confident individuals forms one of the four purposes of the curriculum, the four purposes that should drive and inform all of our decisions around the curriculum, but also that health and well-being has parity as an area of learning and experience in status with the other areas of learning and experience. And I think in the context of the new curriculum, when we've been talking about this for what feels like so long now, it's easy to pass over those things. It's easy to forget, I think, where we've come from. And when we think about health and well-being in the curriculum, it's not a bolt-on, it's not an addition, it's not something that we feel we should do because for one reason or another. It is seen as a critical enabler of learning. And if we don't support our learners to be well enough, to be happy enough, to be fulfilled enough to learn, then learning will be that so much harder. And as I say, this is recognised in the Curriculum for Wales framework, and its role as both as an AOLE and in the four purposes is paramount to that. The second thing I want to talk about is the role and opportunity that a purpose-driven curriculum offers us around health and wellbeing education. I've already mentioned the four purposes, and obviously, as I say, they are critical in supporting learners. They are critical in our decision making, and all of our learning, all of learners' learning should directly or indirectly contribute to those, and that of course includes healthy and confident individuals and the key characteristics that are set underneath that. But when I talk about purpose-driven learning, and when the curriculum talks about purpose-driven learning, it's talking about the four purposes, but it's also talking about something else. It's talking about really being clear about why specific learning matters. And there is so much power in this question. There is so much opportunity in this question. And it's a really great opportunity to ensure that our education around health and well-being, our learning, is truly relevant to the learners that we are seeking to support. We are moving from, historically, I think, a position where PHSE has been, not to characterise it too crudely, but has been seen as a list of topics that we've got to cover, or a list of activities that we've got to do. And these topics are, of course, important. They're the way that health and well-being issues manifest themselves in learners and to learners. But it's rarely just about that topic or that activity. And so what the Curriculum for Wales challenges us to do is to really ask, when we're developing learning, when we're planning learning, when we're offering learning to learners, why does that learning matter? And ensuring that learning then is driven by that clear purpose. In health and well-being, this is important, as important in health and well-being as it is across any other part of the curriculum. We should always be asking ourselves, why do quadratic equations matter, and why does that support my learners? Why does this historical period or this piece of literature matter to learners? Why is that important to us as a society? And ensuring that drives the learning, rather than simply, well, we've always done this, or it's the most convenient thing we can do. And so when we come to something like health and well-being, whether it's something like competitive sport, it is so important to ask ourselves why that matters to learners. Why is that important? And you can unpack that. And there are plenty of valid reasons for that, that include physical activity. But if it's about supporting learners to be physically active, then it leads us to a question about what sport or what physical activities that aren't sport are most likely to support my specific learners to be physically active. Competitive sport has other benefits, of course, around resilience, around decision making, around relationships, and all of these are really important things. But being conscious of those purposes does two things for us. It allows us to drive and to tailor that learning to ensure that it achieves those purposes and those why questions and helps support them. But secondly, it also opens questions about whether this specific activity is the most effective in supporting specific or particular learners to achieve those why questions. And so being clear about the why is so important in driving learning. Another example might be vaping. And it may feel ubiquitous, it may feel obvious why we would want to cover that. But by being very clear about that and its importance to learning opens out a much broader question about the different drivers and impacts that might have on a learner's health and well-being, rather than perhaps what might risk being quite a narrow focusing on a particular topic. And so it's not, as I say, that these topics shouldn't be covered or that they're not important, but it's about bringing them back to the underpinning roots and purposes so that they're not simply a disconnected, isolated, siloed thing, but that they form part of a much broader, wider learning experience and progression over time. And the role of SHRN in all of this, the role of evidence and data in all of this is so important because it helps us understand what matters to specific learners and what matters at different points in a learner's development to children generally at different points. And all of this is such important information in having a genuine, open discussion and understanding about how learning needs to be driven by learners' needs and by broader purposes of learning. A third thing that is so important, I think, in the Curriculum for Wales is its emphasis on progression. And again, it's important here, I think, to reflect on where we've come from as a system and where we're going. The Curriculum for Wales is not just about coverage. It's not just about defining progression as covering this topic or covering this topic, but rather it's getting at what are the underlying behaviours and learning, internalised learning, that will support learners to progress and to move forward in their learning, and recognising that different topics that are covered are vehicles to supporting that learning and to supporting that progression. In health and well-being in the area, we had a very interesting challenge, because when we started to ask the question, what does the underpinning progression look like? What does it mean for a learner to progress from one step to another in learning in health and well-being? We found that there wasn't a huge amount of evidence out there internationally. And this really challenged us to ensure that we were drawing on the evidence that we had. The SHRN data and evidence was critical to that. And informing that understanding of progression, but we also drew heavily on the practice and experience of professionals, ensuring we really understood as much as we could what it meant to progress. And you'll see these in the principles of progression within the curriculum for Wales. And as part of that, what's drawn out specifically for health and well-being in the area is that learners over time should be supported to develop their self-regulation as a key principle of how they progress, that they become more aware of their actions, they become more aware of their thoughts and feelings, and they develop over time an ability to influence those and to respond to those appropriately. Another element of progression that's so important to health and well-being is pro-social behaviours. That as they grow, as they develop, they begin to look outwards, they move away from a purely egocentric view and perspective, and they start to develop behaviours that allow them to integrate with society, that allow them to develop empathy for others, and to engage positively with those around them. Another principle of progression, which is common across all of the areas of learning and experience, is a sophistication of knowledge and understanding, and a sophistication of skills. And these two principles together are really important, as I say, across the curriculum, and support us to understand that within learning, within understanding a particular topic, that we don't want learners to simply just cover those. We want them to develop and progress in their sophistication of understanding and their application of skills within those. And that's what changes over time. And so the emphasis has changed. And it's really important then that we use these principles to really understand how we can support learners to progress. And I think, like no other area of learning and experience, progression in health and well-being is by its very nature fluid. I've talked about self-regulation, I've talked about pro-social behaviours, and I'm sure you, like me, feel that we can move quite rapidly in terms of our progression up and down, in terms of how self-regulated we feel and how pro-social we feel. But it's about supporting learners to make progress over time over that, both in the short term and in the long term. And again, of course, the evidence, research and data is so important in understanding this progression and to support an evidence-based approach to learning in progression. And so, for me, the evidence, research and data is critical in understanding how learners' behaviours is changing as they grow and as they develop. But it also helps us understand that as learners develop, as they grow, what topics, what aspects of health and well-being are becoming more pertinent to them, are becoming more apparent to them. And it allows us then to take a longer look and understand how we can preempt some of those issues using data, evidence and research. I also want to talk about the statements of what matters, which are really, really important in the context of all of the curriculum, but in particular around health and well-being. And the statements of what matters were developed to be used together. They're not meant to be buckets of stuff. They're not meant to be silos. They're meant to be lenses that can be used to view different topics to help practitioners and learners understand the root causes and impacts of their health and well-being. We obviously have one broadly relating to physical health, to mental and emotional health, to decision making, to social influences and to relationships. And the purpose of these, the way that these have been designed then, is to help practitioners and learners understand how a single topic can be viewed from a range of different ways, and recognizing that when a particular aspect of health and well-being or topic is raised, where it's an issue for learners, it's very rarely, if ever, about one of those different aspects of health and well-being. It's almost always holistic. It's almost always interrelated. And if we take something like substance misuse, that is a great example of something that we can look at from a range of different lenses. It is obviously something that impacts on physical health. It is often something that is a means of responding to the different experiences that learners that people have, and how they respond to that is part of addictive behaviour. It might be about an experience in itself and how that experience affects and impacts on the mental and emotional well-being of people. It's a decision that people take, and as a decision is influenced by a range of factors, including, as I say, addictive behaviours. It is inherently informed by our social influences and the influences around us, whether that be the people we spend time with, or whether that be wider cultural influences through social media or elsewhere. And finally, something like substance misuse will have a very direct impact, or is likely to have a very direct impact on our relationships, and may be tied up in specific relationships. And so, as a very, very brief, simple illustration there, that shows quite nicely how we can take a topic around health and well-being and not just cover it, not just look at it in isolation, but tie it back to the range of different causes and influences and root issues of health and well-being and drivers of health and well-being, and ensuring that learners are always going back to that and understanding and being supported in those broader drivers and enablers of their health and well-being. The final aspect of the curriculum I want to talk about is one that is perhaps slightly less talked about, which is the duty within the Curriculum for Wales Act for schools to consider the mental health and emotional well-being of their learners when they're making decisions about the curriculum. And again, this places mental and emotional health specifically really, really closely and really tied to a wider range of whole school decisions that are made. And I think this gives a huge opportunity again for evidence, research and data to be used in understanding how different topics that might be covered, it might interlink together, but also then where correlations might exist with wider decisions that are made. And for me, this is so important in supporting us to have a wider whole school approach that again is supported by evidence, data and research. So very, very finally, I hope you have a great and interesting day. And I would just leave you, I suppose, with 3 questions to consider or to keep coming back to, perhaps come back to. If they're helpful, they might not be. But the questions I would pose to you are, firstly, how can we better understand why learning about different aspects of health and well-being matters? Why does it matter to learners, individual learners? Why does it matter to learners generally? And why does it matter to us as a society? Secondly, how can we use data and research to understand the root causes of health and well-being issues, as well as the different topics and issues and activities that might manifest those root causes and might be the effects of those causes? Thirdly, how can we use data, research and evidence to understand what progression really means in the context of health and well-being, and how can we support learners to make genuine, meaningful progress in the ways that we've talked about this morning as they develop, as they grow, and how can evidence and data really support and inform that and build our capacity and understanding about what progression in health and well-being genuinely means. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. As I say, I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I hope you have a great day, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about the outputs and outcomes of your discussions. Thanks very much.